Welcome to The Political Animals, a show where two political philosophers, one a right-wing radical, the other a left-wing heretic, come together to discuss the social, political and cultural issues of our day. I'm Jonathan Cole, one of those philosophers. The other is Holly Lawford-Smith. How's it going today, Holly?
Well, as you know, we've had half an hour of technical difficulties, so we're both a little on edge at this point. How are you feeling?
Good. We've expended our best 30 minutes of intellect and energy on trying to get the technology working, so that doesn't leave much in the tank, and we're only going to tackle a pretty insignificant topic, I gather.
Yes, it's all down here from downhill from here. Today's topic is censorship and counterspeech, and maybe I'll just do a small explanation of course, this is an independently interesting topic, as we hope you agree, dear listener. But it also came out of me feeling maybe a little dissatisfied when I listened back to our last episode, and I think that's just because maybe it's one of our aspirations as political philosophers to kind of always disagree, cheerfully disagree and put multiple perspectives on the table. And I think maybe just describing the details of the case took up quite a lot of space, and we didn't really get that much time to discuss the juicy philosophical issues. And some interesting things got raised, but maybe we just kind of ran out of time to get into them. So one thing I really like about this week's topic is it's going to end up having some implication back to denunciations in particular that we were talking about last week. So for anyone who listened to that episode, this is a nice kind of accompanying episode that might kind of give some more ideas to think about denunciations and disassociations in particular. But I'll say more about that when we get to the relevant part of the discussion. For now, I guess I just want to set things up by saying there's this kind of question we can ask, which is when there is a public problem of hate speech, we can ask as policymakers or lawmakers or as members of society what to do about that problem. And one kind of question, which is the title of the episode, is should we go for censorship and outright banning, or should we kind of advocate for counter speech, like more speech rather than censorship? And we will talk a lot about that in the episode, but a kind of presupposition of that setup of the question is that there is a harm of hate speech that we need to do something about. And I understand you, Jonathan, have some kind of reservations even at that point. So maybe I thought that would be a nice place to start. We could just sort of talk about the harm, if there is one, of hate speech first, and then kind of get into the solutions in a later part.
Yeah, I have a number of aversions or objections, you could say, to the very notion of hate speech. And the first one really revolves around the harm, because the whole notion hinges on the idea that there's demonstrable, meaningful, real harm that occurs as a matter of someone hearing or being exposed to so-called hateful speech. And it seems to me in the literature that the harm, particularly on the part of those advocating bans, is just assumed and asserted. And yet, when you look at the fine print, often the scholarship will note, well, empirically speaking, this is difficult to substantiate. There's contest around whether hate speech, however we define it, which is the second problem we could get into, but let's just assume we can define it objectively such that we could make policy around it. I mean, the only reason we would care is if it's actually harming people in some socially meaningful way or significant, substantial way. And when it comes to the the problem, I think, is that this whole, put it this way, I'm unconvinced that there's a problem here, which might sound shocking to some listeners, viewers. I don't know how you respond to that, but it seems to me so much is riding on the harm thing, particularly when we're talking about the state coercively regulating speech. You have to assume there's going to be some penalty if you introduce hate speech, some kind of fine, maybe imprisonment in an extreme case. So you really want there to be a harm that you're protecting people from. And I find it really curious that this issue's skirted over, and if it's acknowledged that there's some contention around or some debate or ambiguity around the harm, I would think that's where we have to start the the discussion, and I know on the part of policymakers and many advocates, they sincerely believe that this speech is so harmful. But
Right.
I think the kind of speech they're talking about is exceedingly rare.
Yeah.
People can take measures to avoid being exposed to it. I think everyone acknowledges that banning hate speech doesn't remove the hateful attitude, disposition, beliefs, thoughts that people have. And as a libertarian, I'm going to come straight out and say I would get rid of hate speech laws altogether because of this and many other problems. And I would rely on, I just think it's better to focus on action, because it's much easier to demonstrate the harm from violence, aggression, fraud, harassment, coercion. And we have laws that don't even need to be specifically about hate. Like the criminal code deals with most of this. So there are other concerns I have, but that's the first one, because you raised that issue of harm, and I'd be interested to know whether you think hate speech, however we define it, and that's a big part of my concern about the harm, because it can be defined so broadly.
Yeah.
Such that I'll give you one concrete example. I know I'm starting to
Yeah, there's so many points here, and I want to talk about a lot of them already. So stop.
Well, let me just stop there then, because I'm sort of drowning you
Yeah, you
in
are.
my initial. But as you can see, I'm quite
No,
passionate
you've got a lot
about
of
this
thoughts.
issue.
That's awesome. So I just want to take some of them up, so before it goes on too far and we lose the chance. So I think one thing that's very interesting in what you just said is you kind of stated some opposition, then you gave very concrete reasons, but that the kind of speech that we're really worried about, where there is like the most genuine case, you said it's going to be very rare. It might be easily avoidable for the people who would be most hurt by it. And there's this kind of practical concern that bans don't remove it. So there's a presupposition also behind that, which is like, okay, it's not like it's an empty category. And that was a little bit suggested in the sort of early part of what you said, that it's like, well, people talk about it, but no one really says what they mean. And is there really a phenomenon here? So I want to push you a bit to try to find what's this like best case for you, so that like we between us and also the listener, right, know at least like what's the kind of phenomenon that is at stake, where that thing might look quite plausible to be banned or counterspeeched or whatever, but you think it's kind of rare or avoidable. So for me, a very good recent case, I think, was the American politicians, Haitians are eating our pets claim, because that seemed to me like in that small town, you've got a like very like a minority population that maybe, like, I don't know how well integrated or how long standing that population is. I haven't like looked into the details of the case that much. But the idea that you're spreading this myth or rumor that a certain immigrant population are going around like capturing people's beloved cats and dogs and snacking on them, like in a way that's so preposterous that it should not even count. Like people should just think that's misinformation or that's stupidity on the part of certain politicians. But of course, if people start believing that, it's so demonizing of that minority group. It can lead to a lot of resentment. If there's already racial tensions, for example, over like job, like scarcity or whatever, that can be the kind of like lit match being thrown into a tinderbox. So for me, that's like at least a plausible case of a kind of speech recently in the public sphere where it may well count as hate speech and may be the kind of thing that we want to think about, like what is the right response to that kind of speech. What's your take on that case?
I'd say a couple of things. I mean, it's interesting. I know this is just like a case study and neither of us are across all of the facts, but it's kind of interesting to me that you are forced into what we all have to do in every case, which is speculate about possible harms.
Right.
And I say that because it's quite different when someone's raped. That is unambiguously harmful. It's a violation of a person's bodily autonomy. It's often violent. We know it creates lifelong trauma, can have like serious physical injuries. And I just think that's an interesting contrast. It's not like we can't define harm in concrete, objective ways. But, this goes really to the second problem, because I've got to say, Holly, it's an interesting example because I find it utterly ridiculous. The idea that accusing a group of eating cats and dogs could be defined as hate speech. And if
Oh,
that's the
really?
threshold for hate speech, then think about how much speech could be defined as hate speech. And if we're
Hold
talking
on,
about
like even when you
banning it,
think even when you think very seriously about the social relations between Haitians and like say white Americans in is it Springvale or Springville or whatever the place is called?
somewhere in Ohio, and they
When
are
you
recent
really
arrivals, I understand.
Right, so when you really think about the way that the suspicion and hostility and resentment and what it's like to be a Haitian person just functioning in that town, getting their coffee, getting their lunch, do you really still think what a trivial, stupid case?
Well, not if we assume that this creates some kind of tangible harm, but I'm
But what I
extremely
think I don't know
skeptical
what
about
do you
that.
think is so I think maybe this is like at the crux of the matter, right? Because
Yeah,
I'm giving some suggestions, right? I'm saying here's one thing it could do to accuse a recent immigrant group of eating people's pets. It could
yeah.
make all of your daily interactions full of like fear, mistrust, hostility. It could really damage social cohesion. You mentioned like rape as a clear harm, but then you also went on to talk about the trauma of rape. So you clearly think that there are some psychological harms, it's not just physical
Mm.
harm. So then why be like why say like the trauma of a physical assault counts, but feeling like every white person in your community suspects you of eating pets and hates you for that doesn't count? Like what's the
Well, first, I don't think we can assume everyone thinks that. This is part of the problem with speech. Is you've always, if we're talking about public hate speech, however defined, it seems to me relevant whether 3 people hear it or 3,000 or 3 million, right? And then
yes,
I'm not sure
yes.
we can prejudge how every single person is going to respond. I mean, you and I both heard Trump make those claims at his at the debate. I don't know about your reaction, but I laughed out loud because it just sounds
Yes,
so freaking insane.
but
And
Americans didn't all laugh out loud, right? And that's the problem.
well, not all, but many did. He was pilloried in
Well,
the media for it. I don't. I mean, we'd have to go and survey the townsfolk about that, but you can't look at it in isolation either. I mean, as I understand it, these people have gone there because there are jobs that weren't
yes,
being filled by Americans. It's a kind of Rust Belt town, I understand. No offense to anyone from the town that I can't even remember the name of listening. But
bring something.
like, I don't think we can assume that every person in that town's view is going to be completely shaped or even reshaped by this speech. Now, one
No,
thing I
that's
do
fair.
need,
That's fair.
one thing I need, and this is why I really think the facts matter here. And my kind of my contention is that the facts are going to be so difficult to establish in terms of the link between harm and the speech in every case that it makes this unworkable as a kind of policy instrument for banning. And you mentioned counter speech earlier. I mean, I guess what I'm saying is there's been plenty of counter speech against that, and that's the way a free society operates. But
Can I just
what?
stop you before you
Yeah.
move on to that new point? Because we should talk a lot about counter speech, but just on this claim that like the facts matter, I think you're taking that to a like skeptical conclusion where I'm not sure that's the right place to end up. I want to agree with you that the
Hmm.
facts matter, but I want to be open to the idea that like if that town is such that there was already simmering racial resentment over immigration, something like we're seeing with the riots in the UK at the moment, for example, and if, like certain other, and if the people are very credulous and would easily believe these claims rather than just laugh at them, then it might be the case that this kind of speech actually is creating the sort of environment that makes it really hard for people from minority groups to go about their daily lives. And so, like, just yes, the facts matter, but the facts might be such that they make that speech quite harmful, and they might be such that they just make it a laughable, ridiculous thing, and it would be really over the top to come and intervene on it.
Yeah.
So that's just
In other words, I could be wrong about the facts, but that's kind of my point. That
no.
is,
But I think I'm just agreeing with you
yeah,
that the
yeah.
facts matter, but I'm saying you're being a bit hasty to say the facts matter, and that makes me skeptical about the whole thing of like regulating speech. Because it's like, no, if the facts matter, then we leave it to the facts to say whether there are the kinds of harms that we're worried about. And we can sort of agree about what sorts of harms
Hmm. Hmm.
might be serious enough to then start caring about the speech. right? Or is that not a point of agreement in your view?
No, I think I would do away with the whole concept of hate speech myself. But there are other considerations that inform that view. And just one caveat not a caveat, but a qualification I need to put in, because you've rightly exposed the gap that I haven't actually filled, which is, I am not denying that there is offensive speech. I think, would Haitians in that town, even some white people in the town, Haitians anywhere on the planet, migrants of any kind in any context, find that offensive? Yeah, but it's interesting that most scholars in this field make rightfully, I think, a distinction between offensive speech and hate speech. So they want to make a categorical distinction. I think it's all offensive speech. And I agree with these scholars that we can't really set the bar so low at offensive speech. But I think no matter how you define offensive speech, I just think that could actually cover hate speech. And it's not that I think offensive speech is good or pleasant. I'm offended by some speech. I just don't know how in a free society you can do anything. You can protect every single citizen from exposure to offensive speech. And there are some mechanisms so you can protect people from real serious harm, like I said, through the criminal law, physical aggression, violence, that kind of thing. As long as you create enough freedoms, which I think there are more than there's ever been for counter speech. I mean, it's ironic that we are at the time that we become most concerned about hate speech, I would argue, is the moment when minorities and so-called vulnerable people have the most opportunity for counter speech in the history of humankind. And in fact, their speech is so powerful that if they lob the term hate speech, a person can lose their job or whatever. And so I actually think there's this concern about a problem that cannot be eradicated, because you can't remove what's on the hearts of people through any kind of policy, right? In terms of
you can't
hatred
remove
and
what's
the
on the
like.
hearts, but you can certainly remove what comes out the mouth.
Well, not in any straightforward, uncomplicated way that has a lot of downside.
It's not that
I
complicated.
think.
Just make the penalties big enough and people won't do it. You already see people not saying things about trans for no penalty, just for social disapproval. So it's not that hard to get people to shut up, actually.
Yeah, but isn't the trans is a good issue, because you've been on that side of that. As you may or may not know, I worked in intelligence on Islamist terrorism. I used to be a fluent Arabic speaker. I've studied Islamic theology. I've written some scholarship on Islamist terrorism. And the term Islamophobia is it is defined in such a way that makes it almost impossible to honestly and accurately discuss and research the thought of jihadists, because I've had scholars object to me using the term jihadist. And you know what's interesting? That's a term they use themselves. So I'm apparently it's Islamophobic for me to accurately talk about the language.
Sorry, this is just dialectically becoming really confusing now. So,
yeah,
I'm just trying to make the point that, it's not hard to prevent speech. It's not it's not a very difficult thing actually to get people
not in a policy sense.
to not say it. It's not that hard. And there's a distinction between changing how people feel on what they truly believe and at least preventing them from expressing it publicly. So the thing that you just raised is really interesting, the silencing effect of certain words used by minority communities or activists, but I don't want us to get derailed down another pathway.
Holly, I want to push back just on one thing. When you say it's not hard, I can understand and agree with that in one sense, but not another sense. So if it's not hard in the sense that you can write up a law and they exist, and you can have a bureaucracy that enforces the law, and is it hard for governments to police speech? I mean, we have extreme examples where governments suppress a lot of speech. Yes, but I don't think it's easy at all to define what hate speech is. In which case,
But that's a totally other issue, right? So again, I'm just like, I'm channeling the frustration of the perfect listener right now. Like we need to stay on topic, right? Like,
Yeah.
okay, yeah, it's hard to define speech, but is it, once it's defined, is it hard to prevent? No, I'm just trying to make the point. It's absolutely easy to get people to not say the things they think. In fact, we don't even need the apparatus of the state to do it. All we need is a little moral disapproval, and trans is a great example of that, and so is the Islamophobia topic that you raised. Okay, so the question is not, can we get people to shut up when they have feelings? Yeah, we totally can. The question is like, are we justified in doing so? And when you said, no, it's all just offense and we don't have the right to shut other people up because we are offended, I totally agree with that. If it was all just offense, we would not have the right to shut people up. I think I'm just more open than you are at this point to the idea that there is harm. And it's psychological harm. And so it's kind of on a par with this thing you mentioned about the trauma of a physical harm, but it's psychological harm that doesn't come from physical harm. And if we can get in that game, then I think we can be open to the idea of like that there are genuine harms of hate speech in some, even if they're really rare cases. That then would be like the subject of our best case discussion for what needs some solution. And then we're moving to the next part of the discussion where we talk about what that solution should be. And I guess even though you have this libertarian impulse to like, absolutely not, don't do that, for the next part of the discussion, we probably need to just both assume for the sake of argument that there's at least one sentence somewhere that we want to talk about what's the best solution to that problem of that sentence being uttered.
Yeah.
Is that
I am capable, believe it or not, of accepting for the sake of argument that certain speech creates harm and the kind of nature of the speech can be defined in law or whatever.
Yep.
And once you accept that, then certain things follow. And then obviously you have to then talk about whether you ban it, whether you go with state-based counter-speech, whether you have to tolerate it for whatever reason for incommensurable goods. And there are incommensurable goods here, as there always are in all political thinking. And people recognize this in the literature in terms of, freedoms and a free society.
Yeah. No, we should do a separate episode too one day on libertarianism. Yeah, somehow, sorry, I feel like you're the wild bull and I'm the lasso guy trying to be like, come back, but it's quite annoying.
I think that's exactly what's, you're the sane one in this episode. I'm the extremist.
No, because there's so many interesting ideas to take up in every direction, right? So okay.
Anyway,
but
where do you want to go from here, Holly?
I want to go to the question of like once there is some hate speech, like, and we take it seriously and we think it has the sort of harm that the state. Look, here's a good way to put it. Like the state restricts physical harm, and there are some, just accept for the sake of argument, anyone who's listening, there are some psychological harms that are of comparable badness to the physical harms that we all accept the state has a right to prevent, like minor property damage or whatever. Okay, so then so long as you can just buy that equivalence for the sake of argument, then we've got a problem. And the question is, what's the best solution? And one of the papers, so we both read a philosophy paper in common for this episode, and the paper is about whether the right response to hate speech is censorship, so banning outright, or counterspeech. And are you happy for me to just maybe briefly sketch the proposal, and then
I think that'd be a good idea.
Okay, cool.
For people who haven't read the article.
Yeah, and we'll put the article in the show notes. Although I have to say, the two interesting bits that I'm going to outline, they're actually just, the paper is a conduit for these two books where the ideas appear. So one is like Jeremy Waldron's idea of what the harm in hate speech is. So the author presents that quite nicely. And then I think the bit we're most interested to talk about is the author presenting Corey Brettschneider's book's idea about the state's role as a counter speaker. And that's the bit that's going to kind of connect us up with last week's discussion. So the basic kind of thought in the paper is that counter speech, the lame way of saying that we should prefer more speech, that's not the words that the author used, but the lame way is to say like, oh, like it doesn't matter about individuals doing hate speech because the targeted individuals can just do counter speech and everything's fine. So let a million flowers bloom. And that the reason that's lame is like that the targeted individuals often don't have the platform or the authority to speak back, and that it's really unfair in terms of like a distribution of burdens to expect targeted and often vulnerable minorities to be the ones to have to take the burden of speaking back when there are people better placed to do so. And so the interesting, stronger version of the counter-speech line, which is borrowed from Brett Schneider's book, is to say people in positions of authority, like the state and then the politicians acting as the state, they are the counter-speakers. So when there is hate speech, it's politicians in particular who need to speak back against the hateful speech. And that's a way of doing counter speech and avoiding censorship and bans. And so we get the like benefits of the freedoms of not having censorship, but we get a much stronger version of the counter speech proposal. It's not unfair because it doesn't burden minorities, and it's not ineffective because politicians and members of the state have big platforms and a lot of authority that these targeted minority group members don't have. So that's like the basic shape of the proposal. And then a lot of the paper is concerned with sort of showing that, yeah, there's some objections to this counter-speech idea, that it doesn't protect enough or it protects too much. But the author argues that there's a sort of partners in crime problem where bans do worse relative to those objections. So even if there's some problems with counter-speech, there's way worse problems with censorship. And what I really liked about this paper is that you just get a really nice, clear defense of counter-speech over censorship, and bonus, relative to the last episode, you actually get a direct defense of denunciations of hate speech by politicians in particular. And that gives us like a completely new angle on the Moira Demon case and the kind of actions of the Victorian Liberals. So I thought that was super interesting and like a cool thing for us to talk about.
Definitely relevant to that conversation. But let me ask you this, Holly. Were you persuaded by the state-based counter-speech argument?
Oh, I mean, I found it intriguing and I ordered Brett Schneider's book. That's as much as I can say, because I have been teaching on free speech and hate speech for 3 years. I'm currently working on a grant application. I'm interested in like feminist free speech issues and some looming legislation that looks to threaten it. And I am completely unable to come to a view. It just every year I think, okay, this is going to be the year where I read exactly the right set of papers and I come to a view. And alas, I just keep thinking like there's so many interesting, hard questions and I still don't have a position. And so I feel frustrated.
Well, I'm not surprised because we should do away with hate speech. Because this for me is vindicates, even though that's not your intention, it probably doesn't feel like it. Because the truth is, and this was one reaction I had to reading this article, see, you're an extremely intelligent person, you're an experienced philosopher. There is no way out of this conundrum. We're trying to solve a problem that can't be solved here. And I think so much of...
What's the conundrum? Just state what you think is the conundrum.
That we can protect people and uphold their dignity and their standing, all these vague, opaque terms that I hate, like they're so imprecise. Through regulating speech. And I don't, like I say, I don't want to be misunderstood. It's not that I think there's no problem. I think the problem's grossly exaggerated in sort of Western liberal democracies, but I just don't think you can attain the kind of social goods people who advocate bans and even state-based counter-speech think you can. Because I just don't think it's possible to regulate speech because... there's 27 million people in Australia. Some of them are infants and they're not engaged in speech. But, like, I'll tell you a couple of things in this. I didn't buy the Brett Schneider book, and I'll be honest with you, Holly, I barely slept after reading it. That's how disturbed I was by the...
After the paper?
And it's nothing to do with the author. She's clearly intelligent. Like, it's a good piece of scholarship. It's very well written, argued. I found it really intellectually... stimulating, but there was, I mean, this is a Pandora's box we don't want to open, but and I sort of suggested this to you in an email, but it's just yet more evidence for me of how John Rawls has ruined everything in our liberal society. Because this
Can you explain for a listener who doesn't know John Rawls or his work what you mean by that, and what are you saying?
Well, this is why I didn't want to open the Pandora's box, because he's
You don't have to
complex
tell the theory of justice,
thinker.
but I just mean like in general, what's the rough?
And this is my own
Like,
interpretation, and
yeah.
you and listeners may dispute this, and that's understandable, which is why maybe we need to actually go into maybe a Rawlsian theory of justice. But what I don't like about Rawls is I think it assumes that the role of the state is to make society fair, which means what it has to do is constantly rearrange the furniture in the room. And if even one lamp is out of place, you move it, because we can't tolerate a single person who even feels like there's a lack of equity or whatever. I just think this leads actually to a kind of liberal authoritarianism. And that's exactly my aversion to the hate speech, because, and this is why this is why I object to the notion of state-based counterspeech. But as a kind of policy antidote to hate speech, if politicians want to exercise their right to counterspeech, go for it. I don't have a problem with that. But
no, but the
isn't
proposal is much stronger than that, right? It's like they ought to.
yeah,
They
yes,
are the
exactly,
solution.
exactly.
Yeah.
It's a normative proposition, indeed. But even if it's not a normative position, and I am in favor of counterspeech, I think everyone's got the right to engage in counterspeech, and why wouldn't politicians be involved in that? And they can define hate speech as broadly as they want, but isn't one of the things at the heart of the more redeeming case the idea that politicians have different views, just like members of society, on these issues, and a lot of them are contentious issues. And this paper seems to assume, like so many papers coming from this intellectual milieu, that there are these kind of trusted officials that have the wisdom to determine the rights and wrongs on every issue. And yet, whether it's the trans issue or Islamist terrorism or religious freedom, there's a whole, vaccines or whatever. And I know for a lot of people listening, these are cut and dry, black and white.
Yeah.
But they're not for every person. And there is division. And we have to recognize, in my view, that there is room for reasonable debate. And this is where I would rely on John Stuart Mill and this idea that, how do you attain progress without that dialectic of debate if we can't freely inquire into things? And you can look at historical examples where we've closed the door. So once upon a time, it was just taken as settled that women were inferior to men, that black people were inferior to white people.
Yeah.
And, all the people on the left would say, well, that's horrible. Yeah, but, any ideological perspective is capable of gaining hegemony. And if they then determine what is hate speech, it can totally shift. And then, of course, I think, and this is the libertarian instinct in me, whilst the author acknowledges that there's the problem of state hypocrisy here, but she, like so many people in academia, is thinking of it from a kind of left-leaning social justice perspective. So the state can be hypocritical in not allowing, vulnerable minorities. I'm like, there's an elephant in the room here, which is Nazi Germany. When in that, is it the state or individuals or even communities that have perpetrated the greatest hatred against classes of people? Isn't it states? So I'm very skeptical about empowering the state here. And the thing that I think most robbed me of my sleep the other night was, and this is, it's all sounding melodramatic, but I'm being deadly serious here. When the author went into the idea of how do we deal with coded speech, and then gave the example of inner city.
No.
And
That's
welfare.
Are you sure?
Yeah. She may have been talking about Waldron's perspective there, but there's this idea of, well, one of the problems is it's not just overt hate speech in the words someone says. It's the kind of semantic coding such that inner city could be code for black people. And so if you then say something negative about the inner city, and
this was in the objection section, was it? The way that it's like hard to get right.
Let me have a look. I might have a quote. I do have a quotation actually, which may
I know
or
the
may not.
example, like, but I just don't remember her objecting to coded speech in particular.
She wasn't objecting to coded speech. What she was doing was saying, well, how do we deal with coded speech? And then gave what I thought were some preposterous examples, such that using the word welfare could be code for black people are lazy.
No,
And
but the point is, was she saying that coded speech too? I mean, given that she's defending counter speech as always better than banning, you're
yeah,
just saying that we still also don't even want the state counter speaking against coded speech because it's really hard to like agree on what that even is or what the code is or
let me try again and make myself clear. I think, and I hope I'm recalling this correctly. I think in her, and she calls it a pessimistic defense of state-based counter speech. So it's
yeah,
not perfect. One of the
yeah,
ways it's not perfect is it can't really,
do
or
everything.
maybe she was talking about the bans can't really deal with coded speech. I'm saying I was disturbed by the very notion, and this is why I'm so troubled by the notion of hate speech, that we slip into talking about hate speech as coded speech, i.e., what is inferred in the words, but it's not actually in the words. And
But
if
it
we're
is
talking about,
sometimes true, right? I mean, if she's just making the point that there exists such a thing as coded speech, and there has been a lot of discussion about the politics of dog whistles, for example, like, okay, so people weren't allowed to be explicitly racist, so they switched to phrases that kind of let the audience know what they meant, but could be plausibly denied. And inner city and welfare, like it went from welfare queens being explicitly racist to like welfare, which was enough to signal African American in some dialogue. So if the point is just,
allegedly, even though white people are on welfare and live in inner cities too, but yeah,
no, but I
isn't that
mean,
the
there's
problem with this?
empirical political science on this, like who the speakers are, what their previous platforms are, how they're responding to anti-racism norms, how that's changing the way that they get their points across to their audience. I wouldn't want to say, oh, all of that is just the paranoia of the leftist audience. Like, no, if someone presents me a compelling empirical case that that
Yeah,
is indeed what they mean by that word, yeah, that is what they mean. And then
no, it's
separate
not that.
question,
It's not that, Holly. It's the fact that we're talking about the state either banning
that's what I was just
or
going to
as a
say.
normative proposition.
Sorry, so, but one point
Not
is
not
like,
ju- not just banning the words that come out of your mouth, but what I as a listener infer, rightly or wrongly. I mean, I think
but it's
that's
not
crazy.
about I mean, what are they trying to prevent? They're trying to prevent racism, for example. So if you think that racist speech is hate speech, and you can make a compelling case that, like, well, no one says the N word anymore, or no one says that African Americans are inferior, but they have these little dog whistles that they use to tap into that old racial prejudice. That it's not crazy to think that if you're talking about what to do about hate speech, the more clever and creative avoidant hate speech should be part of the discussion too. Okay, so that's just a conceptual point about whether we should be so skeptical about coded hate speech. Totally separate point, and I think you're right to raise is like, do we want the government exercising its judgment about which things actually count and intervening in these dramatic ways on those things? And then, like,
Yeah.
I think you seem to have a very strong, like, no, I don't know if it's just on libertarian grounds or on more grounds than that. Like, you want a minimal state, so you don't want the state in your business in that kind of way. Um,
But it's also, Holly, that the state is people, right? So the state only has any existence through the actors that pass laws, enforce laws, run bureaucracies, police, do all that kind of stuff. And they, being human beings, have different perspectives on different issues. And so
but
the
they're not in
idea,
those roles as individuals. They're in those roles as members of parties that are elected on certain platforms or as public servants committed to impartially enacting whatever government is in power. So again, if you're not super skeptical about like how the whole apparatus of the state functions, yeah, that's part of that person's job
yeah,
as a member of the government or the Minister for Justice or whatever
yeah.
to make certain speech proclamations when something really hateful happens. Then
Like
what's
I
the
say,
objection?
I think parties and MPs, I'm not sure about officials, let's park those, but MPs and parties, governments, cabinets, prime ministers definitely have, in my libertarian perspective, the right to say whatever the hell they want to say publicly. And if they want to counter speech, go for it. I'm just making the empirical observation that there is difference of opinion even in that class of people. So what they're countering is different. That is at the heart of the more redeeming. So she has a particular perspective on women that was not shared by other members of her party.
Yeah.
And the problem is, in a democracy, the power changes hands. So what is deemed as hate speech could quite easily shift according to, take the American accounts, impending American election. If we go Trump or Kamala Harris, isn't it self-evident that there's going to be very different perspective about what constitutes hate speech? Maybe Trump won't even have a hate speech. And I'm saying that's kind of inevitable, and as it has to be in a democracy, in a representative democracy, which is why I don't think it's the government's job to be the arbiter of disputed moral policy questions. I actually think it's better left to not just individuals, but civil society organizations.
Disputed questions, that matters a lot, right? So are you more open to okay, the government shouldn't be intervening to settle matters of open dispute, and maybe that speaks directly to the more redeeming case, because between gender critical feminists and trans activists is very much a matter of open dispute. Mm-hmm. But do you object to the Prime Minister making a statement after a huge neo-Nazi protest that Jews are welcome and respected? Do you object to every bit of the proposal, or are you just objecting in certain controversial cases where you think it would be inappropriate?
No. I think, as I've said, the Prime Minister can
Don't say he's free, because we're talking about him having the obligation, as the paper argued, that public officials, as the state, are obliged to counter speech, and that prevents us from ending up with censorship, because counter speech is preferable to censorship. So it's not an objection to that to say, if the Prime Minister wants to, he can. No, he ought to.
No, I don't see any obligation. Where does it come from?
It comes from the fact that he has the capacity to counterspeak against this hatred of Jews and provide assurance to the Jewish community in Australia that that is not what we, quote unquote, stand for. And that prevents the need for making it illegal to say those things.
That's the proposal, would it be a good thing for the Prime Minister to do it? I think so, but I don't see where the obligation comes from. Wouldn't there be some situations where you might not want to draw attention to... let me put what seems to me to be a paradox here. So if we accept that hearing an utterance causes serious harm, then aren't there clear cases? And I would say the Israel Folau, whatever the thing was he did, I can't remember
He did an Instagram post that had many people disapproved of, and among them was homosexuals.
Yeah. So would you have heard of that if he hadn't have been fired by Rugby Australia and it hadn't have become a huge media storm? Now, if that was so harmful, didn't Rugby Australia's action and all the media coverage expose a huge number of people to harm that wouldn't have otherwise been exposed?
You can't be claiming seriously that the Streisand effect applies to absolutely every instance of hate speech. If there was a big neo-Nazi rally in the centre of Sydney, it's not the politicians coming out and denouncing it that's causing people to know about it. So that's it's a marginal objection, right? Yes, in the case that would bring more attention to the thing than it should get, don't do it. But in the case where you could do something to counteract that very hateful message to a minority group in Australia, and you could do it with the authority of your position as an elected member of parliament, you should do it, argues this author. I think I'm with her, actually.
Well, I agree. I would do it if I were Prime Minister, and
that's
I agree
not
with
the same thing. I would do it. I'm free to do it. It's not the same thing as you ought to do it in virtue of your role.
No. So where does the obligation come from?
Exactly where we've been talking about, that it is a better solution than censorship.
No, not better, an obligation.
It's an improvement on the counter-speech solution of just let the whole market work out how it likes, because it's more fair. and it's more authoritative. That's the normative argument. So at what point?
I'm not hearing where the obligation comes from.
I'm not understanding what you are missing. Like, I really don't get, like, of course you can just say, but I'm a libertarian. That's fine. Like, I just don't accept, like, I'm going to reject this obligation because I don't want the state to be like that.
Let me frame the question that I'm wrestling with, whether I'm trying to understand that seems embedded in your position and the authors. That is, why does a politician have an obligation to say anything in particular?
Are you like, why not be anarchists? Like, is that what you're saying right now?
Well, we
Why
have
is there a
anarchists in
state?
trying to get a
No, but I'm like, okay, we've got a certain framework here, right? That there is a state, and the state like does certain jobs. And so long as we make that assumption, now we have this question. Here's a horrible social phenomenon that's causing some problems. Should the state do something about it? Well, the state would fix a pothole in a road. So why shouldn't the state speak up against anti-Semitism?
Well, I think the disagreement is very subtle. That's the difficulty.
Is it okay?
Here.
I don't get what it is.
So I'm saying, I'm questioning the very presupposition that there's any obligation on any politician to say anything specifically. Do I think it's prudent, wise to actually talk? I mean, I don't know how you're going to stay in office if you don't talk. Are you likely to be condemned if you don't come out and condemn something that the community is deeply concerned about? Yeah, we've seen, we saw Scott Morrison get into a whole heap of trouble because he was on holiday too long when a bushfire was happening. So these are the realities of
that's
politics.
Just strategic stuff, right? So, but do you think politicians have an obligation to conduct, just not speech? Or do you think politicians have no obligations ever?
But see, we're talking about this is all meaningless unless we talk about concrete situations.
No, I don't think it is. It's like, are you just objecting to the state is what I'm trying to figure out. Are you doing a sort of a fortiori, like, because there should be no state or the state should be so minimal, all this stuff is off the table for me, but I'm actually not really saying anything in particular about speech. Speech just follows from my more general commitments. Or are you saying something in particular about speech? So you would accept that there's a role for the state. Politicians have obligations for certain sorts of conduct. You just want to reject it for speech. That's what I want to know.
Well, you picked an example that's kind of pretty cut and dry because, a kind of Nazi rally or whatever. It's hard to imagine any prime minister not doing it. And whilst I don't think there's an obligation, I think it would be political suicide not to do it. And for moral reasons myself, I would condemn it. But let me give you a harder example. Okay, so the war in Israel, because I think this is a real live issue where the Democrats in the US and the Labour Party here is tying itself in knots because it is desperately trying to avoid having to say something because there is a massive divide. There's a Jewish constituency that has very strong views and feelings about the justice and injustice of that war. And then you have a bunch of Muslims, Palestinians, and Arabs that are on the other side of that debate. And that's the kind of example I'm talking about. So on the view you seem to be presenting, okay, you could argue there's hate speech on both sides of that, depending how we define it. The Prime Minister would be under a moral obligation to condemn the hate speech. But isn't the problem here that there's a division about what constitutes hate speech here? So for one person, it's the symbol of Hezbollah. For another, it's saying the words from the whatever to the sea, which apparently infers genocide. And the community is split on this because those who want to condemn Israel say, well, that's not a genocidal statement at all. Don't be ridiculous. And they're also saying, flying a flag, and then Jewish people say, well, I'm not just offended. That brings up all kinds of trauma about the Holocaust. And I mean, isn't my concern is, I don't know why I don't see an obligation, because that seems to me to assume that it's clear cut on every single issue.
No, that's just you're doing. It's like a straw man. Like you're saying, oh, if there's at least one case that's hard, this whole proposal goes in the bin. No, there's loads of hard cases. Maybe for some of them, for lots of open controversial debates, it would be inappropriate for the state to counterspeak because it's not established yet which side is hate speech. That doesn't mean that like the whole proposal of the state, at least sometimes in instances of clear-cut hate speech that most people would agree about or whatever, it's better than censorship for the state to counterspeak. And politicians ought to do that, not just are free to do that. And then that tells us, oh, actually, total revision of the pseudo demon case because it looks like some of the Liberals did what they ought to do and Moira didn't. And now it's going to come down to the question of like how many politicians need to do that thing for the state to have effectively counter-spoken. So I feel a little bit frustrated in that you're picking at like counterexamples instead of like addressing the general proposal, or you think the counterexample knocks the whole proposal over, or I'm just I don't.
No, like the counterexample was meant as an illustration of one reason why I don't think politicians are under any obligation to engage in any specific type of speech. I'm not saying
it
they
only shows
can't.
that they shouldn't in that case because that's a hard and ongoing case. If there's loads of settled stuff like race and IQ and anti-Semitism and hating women and thinking they belong in the home, they could do lots of obligatory counter-speech whenever these really hateful groups arose. So then the author's suggestion would be kind of right, at least in the uncontroversial cases. And then that would be fine. I think that would be fine for her.
Yeah, I suppose, yes, but I think you're arguing the same thing in reverse, so that you're relying on the uncontroversial cases. But if we accept the moral obligation, then a real human individual, Joe Bloggs or Mary Jane, who's going to be the Prime Minister, is going to have to take a stand on every single issue. And I'm saying if they consistently do that...
think that every single issue, I don't know why that feels straw man to me. That's where I'm getting off the boat or whatever.
So really then the obligation, in your view, hinges... Again, it takes us back to the definition of hate speech, which I think is problematic, but let's accept that we can define it. So if we assume that hate speech is kind of settled and we can identify it unambiguously and define it, and that there's a moral obligation because the better solution than banning hate speech is for the state-based counter-speech. Obviously, the Prime Minister or President has the biggest megaphone, the most authority. Although it'd be interesting to hear what you think about a Trump president, because the person that many people find odious can obviously get into that position. Some would say he is the president of hate speech, which kind of I would cite that as evidence, an exhibit in the favor of my case, actually, of why I'm not sure we want to place so much duty on our political leaders. But yeah, I can see the logic of the argument, but I suppose, I've slipped back into the fact that I've basically said we should do away with hate speech, so it's hard for me to not slip back into, if you accept my position that we can't really define it, there's a question mark about the harm, it's hard to define the harm, it's differential, there's what is hate speech for one person is just sort of inquiring for another and vice versa, which is why I'm not sure I'd want my Prime Minister there to be an obligation. But also, just from a kind of philosophical point of view, I don't feel like I've heard from you where this obligation comes from. Does it come from something to do with the nature of representative democracy, or just the human morality based on...
I mean, I don't know what more I can say than what she has already said in the paper and that what we have already gone over. And maybe this just reveals that, like, sometimes in a philosophical dispute, like, you're just not buying it. Like, and then it doesn't help, I guess, to keep repeating the same thoughts. And I will concede that there's lots of very difficult issues here. Like, what are the parameters of the state, and like which exact individuals count as speaking as the state? Like, that's a very big philosophical question to settle. What are the right parameters of how to set up a good definition of hate speech? That's another huge issue. I think just for me, instead of it's going to sound like I'm summarizing you, but I don't mean to be. When I said earlier for myself, I've been teaching this for a long time, I've been thinking about it for a long time, and I still don't have a view. My take is just like, there's a lot of really hard stuff to settle and pin down, but we can do it. And so it's worth the kind of ongoing enterprise to try
Yeah.
to do it and then eventually get to like a really nice, settled, precise view. And that is what I hope to do, like at some point in the next 5 years or something. So I don't know.
Can I ask you one question in the remaining time we've got, which
Do
I
we
think
have
will
time?
be
Because
clarifying?
are you keeping an eyeball on the
Yes,
time?
it'll have to be quick.
Very quick.
But see, I think if I'm correct, you are taking perhaps a more minimalist view than what is common in the literature. In that, I suspect you would define hate speech a bit more narrowly than some of the more capacious, expansive definitions. And I want to read you one quote from the article, which goes to my concerns, which kind of informs, I think, the debate we just had. And I'd be interested just to get your response, and then we can finish on that. Because at the heart of this article is this notion of the dignitarian defense of banning free speech. And the author, while she says, look, banning's not effective and state-based counter-speech, although not perfect, is a better solution. She accepts the dignitarian sort of harm, if you like, of hate speech. So I just want to read the quote and then I'll explain what disturbed me about it. And this will get to whether you are working with a narrower definition of hate speech, but it may also help you understand my concerns. I don't expect it to convince you, but this is the quote. In decrying detestable speech, the state is reassuring its targets. It is saying, we are sorry that you had to hear that. It's true some individuals unfortunately still believe this, but on behalf of the people generally, rest assured that we stand by you and they, not you, are the outliers, and that we will ensure that what they say remains an empty threat. So it's this, I find this extraordinary. There's this kind of like the mummy state is going to embrace you in her arms and reassure you that, you're valued. And this is the problem of this whole dignitarian thing, where it's not...
You're being such a predictable, like, I can just think of the leftist blue-haired listener that's just like, that is just a middle-aged white man talking. Like, do you know what I mean? That will be what they will say, because you're just giving absolutely no empathy to the cases where that quote you just read out would make perfect sense. Really hateful, dehumanizing speech about Indigenous people, for example. Really hateful, dehumanizing speech about Jews or about women. If you think about those really vulnerable minority groups and the most hateful, essentializing, demeaning, degrading speech about them, and a person of authority in the state coming in and saying, those guys are just fucking muppets. There's only 3 of them. Just ignore them. They don't speak for everyone here. You are welcome. You are support. That's not the mummy state. That is just reasserting that people have equal value or whatever.
I'm not sure you can dismiss so lightly the banners. They're in your posse, aren't they? I mean, you're taking a sort of... Well, these are the arguments not just of the state-based counter-speech, but those who want to ban speech.
Totally, yes. There's a question of what's the best solution. All I'm doing is advocating on behalf of the people that take this harm really seriously. And I think you are sounding like they're a caricature of the conservative male who just doesn't even get himself remotely into the headspace of what could be so horrific about speech like that and could justify some sort of response. And then we're back in the game of what's the best response? And I'm like, what? How are you so dismissive?
To me, it's got nothing to do with empathy, because what we're talking about is if we're going to particularly enact laws to ban, then the language becomes crucial, because that law is language, and the judges have to interpret the language. And if the
the question is, why is your sympathy, why are you so much worried about the freedom of the hate speaker versus the harm to the minority? Why is that your concern?
I'm not even thinking about the hate speaker.
But you are, because you want to protect them, right? Why are you fighting for...
No, I don't want to protect them.
Well, okay,
why would you even assume that?
Because what's going on in this argument if that's not... You are against the regulation of that kind of speech, and I'm just trying to push you to take it a bit more seriously.
I don't think hate speech can be defined in subtle and accurate and precise enough way that it's not going to be misused and abused by activists and or the state, and that it's not going to affect the general freedoms that we need in order to progress in our intellectual development as a society and to solve problems. And
This is a
I'm not
totally
convinced.
other point than you have been making throughout the episode. So maybe we need an episode 2 on hate speech just to continue this discussion.
This was actually our first genuine debate, which was
Yep.
quite exciting. Well, if you enjoyed listening to this debate/conversation, folks, and if you're listening on the podcast, be sure to follow and consider giving it a 5-star rating on Apple or Spotify if that's where you're listening. If you're watching on YouTube, subscribe if you haven't already. Give us a like or a dislike. Some people like to dislike us. We don't mind. We appreciate the
There's a meme comment.
interaction and engagement.